Good morning in Washington. Good evening in Singapore and Jakarta. This is David Merrill, the president of USINDO. Welcome to our USINDO Open Forum on Indonesia and the state of Southeast Asia with the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. This will be on the state of public opinion in Southeast Asia about world developments, with a focus on Indonesian public opinion based on a very recent study. Our Vice President, Chris Wyrod, will moderate the program. Chris, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Merrill. And again, good morning to everyone, those of you joining us in the US, and good evening to everyone joining us in Asia. I'm Christopher Wyrod, as Ambassador Merrill said, Vice President of the United States-Indonesia Society in Washington, D.C. I'd like to welcome you to this open forum today on Thursday, May 21st, entitled Indonesia and the State of Southeast Asia. So as Ambassador Merrill said, we'll be taking a deep dive today into Indonesian public opinion. We'll be exploring Indonesians' perceptions of many political, social, and economic changes that have been happening in Indonesia, the ASEAN region, and even the rest of the world. We'll hear what Indonesians see as the top challenges they face, their main geopolitical concerns, and how they see major powers' influence and rivalries in the region, especially between the US and China. We'll also learn about who Indonesians trust and who they distrust, and their attitudes towards soft power in the region. The data comes from ICES's landmark annual survey called the State of Southeast Asia, which they've been doing now for nearly a decade. The 2026 survey report was published just last month, so data is still quite fresh. And you can download the full State of Southeast Asia survey report on the ICS website. We're very happy to be joined today by a panel of experts from the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. So let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. First, we'll hear from Melinda Martinez, who is a fellow and acting co-coordinator of the ASEAN Studies Center at the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. She'll present the survey data on Indonesia and provide insights on the longitudinal trends in Indonesia and comparative data from Indonesians' neighbors in ASEAN. Then next, we'll move to our discussants, and we'll hear from Julia Lau, who is a political scientist and coordinator of the Indonesia Studies program at ICS Yusof Ishak Institute, and Dr. Siwage Dharmanegara, an economist and coordinator of the APEC Studies Center. Together, they'll discuss the survey findings and the implications for evolving public opinion in Indonesia. After that, we'd be happy to take questions from our online audience, which you can type in the Q&A box, should be at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. Please use the Q&A box, and then we'll get to your questions. So let's start with Melinda. Let me hand over to you, Melinda. We're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you. Over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris, for giving a brief introduction about our survey. I'd like to present my screen. Hopefully you can see it now. Okay, great. Yeah. Before I share with you some of the highlights from the survey, I think it will be interesting for me to start off this conversation by giving an introduction, a little bit introduction about the survey, the objectives, and also methodology of the survey. So the State of Southeast Asia survey is now in its 8th edition since it was started in 2019. It gauges the views and perceptions of Southeast Asians who are in the position to inform geopolitical developments, major power influence, and also rivalry affecting the region. What makes our survey quite unique compared to other regional polls out there is that respondents are screened based on their knowledge about ASEAN and interest in current affairs. As a result of that, Some media, international media and regional media, refer to our survey as an elite opinion maker poll. The survey is not purely a longitudinal study, as the sample shift each year to allow different respondents. Our objective is that rather than surveying the same individuals every year, this approach allows us to better capture the Southeast Asia's emerging opinion makers, as our focus is on the broader ASEAN community. So about this year's report, as you can see here, we collected a total of more than 2,000 respondents from Southeast Asia, including Timor-Leste, which is now a full member of ASEAN. Out of these 2008 respondents, around 12% are from Indonesia. This year's survey consists of 43 questions and was conducted over the period of 6 weeks from January 5th until February 20th. This period coincided with heightened geopolitical uncertainties, including developments following the United States intervention in Venezuela, but preceding the tension in the Middle East. I think, if I'm not wrong, the US-Israel attacks on Iran happened on 28th of February. But I would say that the perception captured in this survey might be influenced by those global developments. As you can see here, the survey was offered in several languages to improve the accessibility of the people who can participate. An equal weighting was applied to all ASEAN member states when calculating the regional average to ensure that each country's responses are represented in equal proportion. As you know, for those of you who follow ASEAN closely, ASEAN operates fundamentally on a consensus-based decision-making model. So this methodology reflects the culture of the regional organization itself. So let's delve into some of the findings from this year's survey. A majority of Southeast Asians, at 60%, identify climate change and intensifying extreme weather events as the region's most pressing challenge. The percentage is slightly higher than last year. Worries about intensifying economic tensions between major powers is now the second most pressing issue, while concern over domestic political instability has emerged as the third option this year. The top 3 concerns among respondents from Indonesia are similar to the top 3 regional concerns, which are climate change, unemployment and economic recessions, and domestic political instability. Moving on to the top 3 geopolitical concerns in the region. Across the 8 geopolitical events surveyed this year, US leadership under President Trump has overtaken the concerns over the South China Sea last year to become the top concern this year. Global scam operations continue to rank second this year, while aggressive behavior in the South China Sea is in the 3rd place this year. But nevertheless, the South China Sea issue still ranked the highest for 3 ASEAN claimant states, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Brunei. Top 3 geopolitical concerns among respondents from Indonesia are US leadership under President Trump, Israel-Hamas conflict, and global scam operations. Just to give you, this is some sort of cumulative trend among Indonesian respondents, which I find quite interesting. As you can see here, the Israel-Hamas conflict has consistently ranked among the top 3 concerns among respondents from Indonesia in the past 3 years. Concerns over the South China Sea dispute were quite prominent in 2024 and 2025, but they appear to be tapering off this year. If you look at the overall trend, I would say that this year's top geopolitical concerns among Indonesian respondents are far more wide-ranging. spanning from political developments in the United States, traditional conflict, and also non-traditional security concerns like global scam operations. Now, moving on to the Myanmar issue, I think it is very interesting to follow from the Indonesian lens. As you probably know that the support for the Myanmar cause remains high among the Indonesian civil society. During Indonesia's ASEAN chairmanship in 2023, Indonesia made a lot of efforts to mediate the conflict among different stakeholders in Myanmar. At the regional level, respondents prefer ASEAN to engage in independent dialogue with all stakeholders. The second most preferred option is to downgrade or to limit ASEAN's engagement with the regime. The majority of respondents from Indonesia want ASEAN to engage in independent dialogue, similar to the regional voice. There is growing support for downgrading or limiting engagement with the military regime, as well as mounting coordinated responses with international partners among Indonesian respondents. Similar to the Myanmar conflict, I think the Cambodia-Thailand conflict was quite interesting to look at from both ASEAN's and Indonesia's perspective. When Thailand and Cambodia clashed over the Preah Vihar temple in 2011, one of Indonesia's most notable diplomatic intervention took place. As ASEAN chair at that time, Indonesia, under then Foreign Minister Martina Talagawa, conducted shuttle diplomacy between Thailand and Cambodia to really help to mediate the dispute. In fact, the style of mediation conducted by Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim last year was still very much carrying the spirit of shuttle diplomacy started by Indonesia. If you look at the finding here, more than 1/3 of the respondents agree that ASEAN has taken active steps to mediate the crisis through the convening of ministerial meetings and the deployment of diplomatic engagements. This is the top choice for ASEAN member states, including Cambodia and Thailand themselves. The majority of respondents from Indonesia generally share this sentiment, but the view that ASEAN has not used all the tools at its disposal is the strongest in the region. This is a quite interesting question about regional leadership. We asked our survey respondents, apart from your own country, which ASEAN member state has shown the strongest leadership within ASEAN in addressing regional challenges. The majority of regional respondents identified Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia as the top 3 regional leaders. Indonesia was the top choice among respondents from Myanmar, as well as Brunei and Laos. Interestingly, the top 3 regional leaders were chosen for different reasons. Respondents who selected Singapore mainly cited its economic leadership. Those who chose Indonesia highlighted its ability to build consensus within ASEAN. For Malaysia, most respondents pointed to its strong leadership during last year's ASEAN chairmanship. Now, let's move on to the next section about major powers' regional influence and leadership. For this year's survey, the majority of respondents view ASEAN as the leading champion of free trade and economic cooperation, similar to the perception last year. Strongest proponents for ASEAN are found in Indonesia. ASEAN ranked first ahead of China and the United States, while the US fell to 4th place at 15% this year. This is really reflecting growing concern over the US trade leadership under the second Trump administration, particularly following the imposition of tariffs and other trade measures. For the first time, ASEAN emerged in the top position with the most confidence to uphold international law. edging ahead of the United States, with the EU close behind. This is a shift in perceptions of normative leadership in the region. Similar to the finding in the previous question about economic leadership, here we see that confidence in ASEAN is particularly strong in Indonesia. Next, it's about dialogue partner strategic relevance to ASEAN. China continues to rank first, followed by the United States and Japan, with a slightly wider gap this year between China and the US. This suggests that perceptions of Beijing's strategic relevance have strengthened relative to Washington over the past year. Interestingly, perception among Indonesian respondents differs slightly from the regional trend. Indonesian respondents rank China first, Japan second, and the US third. Beyond the top three, the EU remains in fourth place, followed by Australia. One interesting shift this year is that the Republic of Korea has edged ahead of India, while the UK, Russia, Canada, and New Zealand continue to be as more secondary players in ASEAN strategic calculations. Moving on to probably the most interesting part of the survey. This is highly cited by regional and international media. It's about US-China rivalry and its impact on Southeast Asia. In the survey's binary question between China and the US, as we can see here, a slim majority of respondents at 52% chose China over the US, reversing last year's result and also underscoring how finely balanced regional sentiment remains. Support for China is stronger in 6 ASEAN member states, namely Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Timor-Leste, Thailand, and Brunei, while the US remains preferred in the Philippines, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Vietnam. However, the trend among respondents from Indonesia is particularly interesting. I would like to spend a little bit more time here on this finding to explain the broader story behind this trend. But later on, I believe Julia, Pak Wage, and the audience in the Q&A may also have comments on this finding. If you just look at the chart closely here, there is a significant shift in Indonesian respondents' strategic preferences over the past 7 years. In 2020, at the start of COVID-19 pandemic, Indonesian respondents were almost evenly split between China and the US. However, this year, 2026, support for aligning with China has risen sharply to 80%, while support for the US has fallen just 20%. I think one key turning point appears to be 2023. If you just look at support for the US, here it was generally stronger between 2021 and 2022 during the early period of the Biden administration. I think at the time, President Biden introduced several initiatives aimed at strengthening its engagement in Asia, including the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or known as IFEF. However, from 2023 onwards, support for China overtook support for the US, and the gap has continued to widen significantly since then. Several geopolitical developments may help explain this trend. The escalation of the Gaza conflict and the broader instability in the Middle East appear to have negatively affected perception of the US among Indonesian respondents, particularly given Indonesia's strong public support for the Palestinian cause. Economic considerations also seem to play an important role here. Under the second Trump administration, the introduction of reciprocal tariffs may have weakened confidence in the US as a reliable economic partner. I think definitely this is a very fascinating trend from Indonesian respondents. Now, moving on to the last section of the survey. It's about perception of trust, trust and distrust rankings of major powers in the region. As you can see here, in terms of trust and distrust rankings of major powers in the region, Japan remains the most trusted power in the region, followed by the EU, the US, China, and India. Japan continue to lead as it reflects its reputation as a responsible stakeholder that respects and upholds international law. One interesting development to highlight in the report is that although, as you can see here, China and India remain lower in overall rankings, their trust levels have exceeded this trust level for the first time since the survey began in 2019. This may suggest a gradual shift in regional perceptions toward a more diversified and multipolar strategic environment. This is just to give you a brief information regarding trust and distrust levels of the United States among respondents from Indonesia. It is interesting to take a closer look here. Since the survey began in 2019, distrust toward the US has generally outpaced the trust almost every year among Indonesian respondents. But it is particularly concerning this year that the level of trust has reached an all-time low. If you look at the report closely, interestingly, Indonesian respondents who distrust the US mainly attribute their concern to the perception that US economic and military power could be used to threaten their country's interests and sovereignty. So this is a very fascinating trend, I would say, and I'm happy to discuss this further later on. So with that, Chris, I'd like to end my presentation here, and I'll pass back the screen to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Melinda. That was really excellent. You've given us so much to think about, and excellent job in distilling all that diverse data into some really telling and relevant facts and great visuals there too. Thank you so much. So now we'll move on to our discussants. Let me first invite Julia Lau. She is the Principal Fellow and Coordinator of the Indonesia Studies Program at ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. She's also the Deputy Managing Editor of the Institute's Commentary and Analysis website called Fulcrum, which I'm sure many of our audience have visited. She's recognized for her expertise in Indonesia's domestic politics, foreign policy, and role as a middle power. And she's also lectured in political science in the US at Georgetown, Catholic University, and also McDaniel College. So let me invite Julia to give us some of your thoughts. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you so much, Chris. I was just telling your admin person before we started that I used to attend USINDO events when I was a grad student at Georgetown. So it's a real pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting all of us. So Melinda's done a really good job, like you said, of distilling this year's survey. And I thought as a discussion, I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of the survey questions or, how each one was answered by Indonesians, but maybe sketch out a couple of broad trends, and then hopefully in the Q&A we'll take up some of those issues as well, depending on what the audience is interested in. So one thing to note would be this idea of trust, right? The one that she showed earlier about, how Indonesians seem to trust the US less. And I think this skepticism regarding not just the US, but even the EU and India, trends started in about 2024. And back then the question was, would you trust these powers to do the right thing? So that was the phrasing, to do the right thing, to uphold the international order or to uphold the rule of law. And Indonesia, together with Malaysia and Brunei, which are the three Muslim majority countries in Southeast Asia, right, who are members of ASEAN, all had very interesting results. If you look at the survey sort of post, what happened on 7th October 2023, There were some interesting trends as well when the Russian attacks against Ukraine started. So some of that traces back to those two conflicts specifically when it comes to reactions to the US and Europe. And for this year, the timing, like Melinda said, was important. So it happened that we finished taking the survey results just before the war in Iran began. And a lot of people ask, what do you think would have happened if you just extended the survey by a week or two? I really do wonder whether the distrust numbers would have just skyrocketed, because I think Indonesia as a whole is reacting to the entire Middle East situation in a very sort of visceral way. And that's not going to go away, even though other issues, like Melinda said, come up and, take over from time to time on people's attention span. So that's one big bucket of issues. This idea of, can we trust the great powers? Can we trust other middle powers? Who are the best partners to work with to stabilize our own country? And in today's world, where at least looking at it from Southeast Asia, it seems that a lot of the rules and a lot of the norms that we thought existed in the world order seem to be breaking down, or that some of the great powers or middle powers seem to be ignoring these norms or practicing geopolitics and geoeconomics in a way that is surprising to a lot of people in the region. I think the Indonesian elite opinion is constantly shifting depending on what the issue is, but to explain this rise of trust in China, and bear in mind it's a forced question, so it's not a realistic question, because most people would say, I don't want to choose, or I choose to work with both. But in this question, we force them to make a choice, so that's how you get that result. So I think that to take away from that response a view that, Indonesians don't want to work with the US is not correct. So it should be interpreted as, we really want to work with you, but you're making it really hard for us to do it right now, given all that's going on in trade and other things, right? Then maybe I'll just jump from there to a very different issue about ASEAN itself. So a couple of the results were interesting, where ASEAN jumped to the top of the table. And I think it's also a reflection of ASEAN countries maybe coming into their own, being a bit more confident in our own institutions and in the region, to find solutions where none existed before, not just in terms of creating minilaterals or new sort of architectures to circumvent some of these issues, but you will realize, so for instance, that climate change, is the top concern. You need everyone on board to solve that kind of issue. You need the whole region to move together in the same direction. So that might explain why people are choosing ASEAN rather than an external partner. And it actually bodes well for Indonesia. It's the second placed sort of, other than your own country, which ASEAN member state do you sort of rely on the most or trust in the most to lead ASEAN. Indonesia does have a role to play. It's the largest country in the region, and currently it's got a very outward-facing president, but he also has a lot of domestic problems to deal with. So we haven't talked about that at all, but if in the Q&A there's time, we can try doing that. And finally, I think there's a sort of great fear that Southeast Asia might become an arena of great power competition. So that's not new, right? Wars have been fought in Asia, and we all don't want the Third World War to be happening anywhere near us. Some people say it's already happened, but I'll leave it at that. Political scientists tend to be a depressed lot, but hopefully Wage, who's an economist, will have slightly happier things to say, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julia. You raised some important points, and although you say you're pessimistic, actually gave us some reasons for hope. So that's good, especially with the U.S. relationship. Well, let me now turn it over to Dr. Siwage Dharmanagara. He is the principal fellow and also co-coordinator of the Indonesia Studies program with Julia, and coordinator of the Singapore APEC Studies Center at ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. His research focuses on macroeconomic and development issues, industrial and trade policies, with a special focus on Indonesia, of course, being Indonesian. Before joining the Institute, he worked as a researcher at LIPI, which is the Indonesian Institute for Science, and as a consultant at the World Bank in Jakarta. He received his PhD in economics from University of Melbourne. Over to you, Dr. Siwage.
Well, thank you, Chris. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, we can hear you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and good evening for those of you joining from Asia. I would like to start by thanking USINDO, particularly Ambassador David Merrill and Chris Wyrot, for inviting us to share the survey findings and to be a discussion for this exercise. I think my maybe intervention will focus on the last slide that Melinda shows, right? On when Indonesian are forced to choose between US and China, and where will you put your your trust, right? And from the survey this year, seems like 80% of the respondents, they choose China. So does it mean that Indonesia has become pro-China? So the question is, whether Indonesia has become pro-China than pro-US. Yeah. So if we just look at the number, 80%, maybe we can interpret that, Indonesia has taken side. Indonesia has become China ally. But I think I need to maybe remind everyone that we need to be cautious as well to really take these numbers. Again, perception survey always have some issues depending on the timing and context as well. When events happen, some event happen, then it may quickly change the perception. And we also know that from Melinda's presentation that the number of respondents are also quite selective. Like it's just the elite, considered as the elite, and it may be different from the public opinion as well, right? So the elite may see, for example, climate issue or geopolitical issue as more important issues. But the public maybe have a different opinion. Maybe the public will see that the daily issues like jobs or inflation or corruption, they're more concerned about that issue. So elite and public are very different in terms of seeing things. And when we talk about the elite, Indonesian elites, they are not homogeneous. They are different in perception as well within the so-called elite in Indonesia. So I think we need to be careful in interpreting all these the findings from the survey. So the 80% is not really the final numbers. It may change. What will happen in the next iteration of this survey? We will see maybe things will be the same kind of the same trend, positive, increasing, but also can be declining. It depends on the situation on the region and the world. So that is the first point. And I think the second point that I would like to discuss is about the concern that Indonesian respondent raised on the US policy under Trump's administration. I think this is quite reasonable, as we all know that the tariff policy that being implemented under the Trump's second administration, it has affected the economy of many US trading partners, including Indonesia. So there's concern, especially from Indonesia point of view. The concern is that this US policy may affect either economic and also political stability in Indonesia. So that's why it becomes the number one concern from Indonesian point of view. And the next point is about the ASEAN role. Many Indonesian respondents think that ASEAN role is very important and ASEAN centrality is very important. But perhaps what this perception say, what is the elite said in the survey may be quite different from what the action taken, right, during the kind of negotiation, for example, with the US administration. I will take an example of the tariff negotiation. So if Indonesia really put ASEAN centrality, Indonesia will not kind of send the trade negotiation team to Washington right away after the what is that, the what's so called the Trump's Liberation Day
Liberation
tariff.
Day,
Yes, yeah. So instead of rushing to go to Washington DC to negotiate about the lower tariff, Indonesia should take more maybe strategic move by discussing with ASEAN members how to approach this tariff policy from the US. Yeah, so that is something that I feel a bit contradictory because at one point the elite say that ASEAN is a priority for Indonesia, it's central, but then in reality, when there's a crisis, then the biggest member in ASEAN is actually not kind of putting ASEAN as the priority, right? But putting its national interests as a priority. So Indonesia sent the team and then trying to negotiate the best outcome for the country. And Indonesia is not the only ASEAN members that doing that. Yeah, there are many other countries that also doing the same thing. But again, this is a big question for ASEAN because how can ASEAN still or remain central when each members are actually dealing separately or during the crisis? And the last point that I would like to discuss is about the US-China rivalry. As we know that this rivalry will continue despite that President Trump has visited Beijing. Yeah, but the tension is still there, and the trade tension or even geopolitical tension may still continue after the meeting. So the big question is that how Indonesia navigate when the US-China continue to kind of basically implementing their own policy to protect their own interests. And this will affect the Indonesian economy as well. Yeah, so as we already know that under the current administration, Indonesia has decided to join the Trump's Board of Peace. What is that initiative? Yeah, this may be seen by China as like as a move that Indonesia moving towards US orbit. And it may cause some maybe some issues later with bilateral relation with China, between Indonesia and China. So we need to anticipate what will be the reaction from China when Indonesia joined Board of Peace. And also when Indonesia started to maybe getting closer again to China, what will be the reaction from the US? Yeah, so we will still continue how this US-China rivalry will affect Indonesian foreign policy and also economic policy. So I think that will be a big question for everyone here. I also don't know what will happen, but it can maybe trigger more discussion later. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Pak Wagye. That's great. Very interesting perspective on economics, especially the trade negotiations and how that may be playing a part. I really appreciate that. Well, great. Thank you, all three. Wonderful presentations and thoughts. So let's move to the next phase, which is our Q&A. Again, if you have a question, please do type it in the Q&A box on Zoom, and we'll get to it. I see one or two, but let me ask a quick question to Melinda about some of the correlations in the data, if possible. Just a clarifying one, Melinda. At the outset, when the survey asked Indonesians what their top concerns are, you mentioned to us that this year it's become the administration, the Trump administration is number one. Previous years, it was Israel is number one. Israel's gone to number two. Is there any way we can see a correlation between those two? Like, clearly US support for Israel could also be affecting perceptions that would put the administration at the number one concern. Is there any way to know about those kind of correlations between concerns in your data? Over to you, Melinda.
Unfortunately, we haven't really looked, some correlation between questions, but to me, the general sentiment is quite uniform, right? If you look at the Indonesian perception, I think the concerns towards the United States in this year's survey, particularly, I think it's prominent in all of questions. If you look at like the role of the United States in its leadership and in international rules-based order, it's declining. If you look at the perception of trust in the United States, it's also declining. So there are some sort of similarities across questions. So if you would like to correlate that way, I think it's definitely something very interesting. And we need to look at the data very closely.
Okay, thanks. That's great to get the kind of informal correlation. So we do have a couple questions here. Let's see, let me go to the questions. We have an initial question, more about, again, the data, like how granular the data is. If there's any breakout by religion, region, socioeconomic status, if there's any more granular data on those
Yes.
from the respondents, that'd be great to share.
Yes, I wish I could collect those, Chris, but unfortunately, because of resource constraint, we cannot collect a lot of respondents' background data. But for sure, we have several data on, I think, first one is affiliation, whether, the respondents are coming from the private sector, think tanks. So it allows us to do cross-tabulation. We also have, this year is quite interesting because we also look at how our respondents consume regional, media. It's fascinating to look at from that perspective as well. And we also have age groups, which is quite interesting. But so far, we try to do some correlations based on their profiles. The difference is not that significant, I would say. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know.
So,
Right, like
yeah.
quite uniform in their responses. Okay.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Let me move on to the next question. This comes from our co-chair, Ambassador Robert Blake. He appreciates very much the interesting presentation. Let me just read his question verbatim here. Given the erosion of trust in major powers, did ICS ask respondents which countries or groupings can take more responsibility? For example, Mark Carney's famously called on middle powers to take more responsibility recently, but divisions within groupings like BRICS show that might be hard. What are your thoughts about that, of groupings of countries being more responsible? I think you did mention something about ASEAN centrality and
Yes.
how people feel about that.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah. The first one is the first main trend is that ASEAN rules is becoming much more prominent here in this survey. So the trust, to really use ASEAN as a regional institution to sort of becoming more proactive in responding to regional and international challenges is becoming prominent. And then the second one is, I would say, the role of middle power is expanding. The perception towards the EU is improving this year compared to last year. And then, as I mentioned to you, quite interestingly, India. I think the perception towards India is quite positive this year. Since our survey conducted in 2019, the distrust level in India has been always outpacing the trust level. But for this year, surprisingly, the trust level is exceeding the distrust level. So yeah, ASEAN as a multilateral organization and several middle powers are becoming much more prominent.
Maybe let me
Thank you.
jump in here. Let me jump in here to say that one way to read that table where India and other countries are sort of having more trust put in them, that's a sort of indirect way of saying these countries can take on more responsibility. ASEAN is looking to you, wants to work with you more. So it's not a direct question. And I guess Southeast Asians are famous for being indirect. But so while we don't sort of directly call on people or say, you need to do X or Y, this fluctuating level of trust may be one indicator to sort of reflect that situation.
Some analysts also indicate that probably it's a hedging strategy because the situation, especially between the US and China, is very uncertain. So ASEAN is looking for other partners as well to hedge again, the two major powers strategic competition.
Right, thank you. Great, it's very helpful. Maybe the next question I can direct to Dr. Siwage. More about economic development. I know this probably wasn't a question directly asked about USAID's end of USAID, but any kind of thoughts in general or any inklings that come out of the survey regarding this, major change in development assistance for the region and in Indonesia with the dismantling of USAID?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and thank you for the question. Yeah, I think USAID has been playing a very important role in developing the US soft power in Indonesia, right, for many years. And yeah, through the scholarship and capacity building, right, there are a lot of support for Indonesia development goals. So with the decision to terminate this USAID, there of course there's an impact on all these programs that used to support the institutional building in Indonesia and policy making as well. So I think we can revert to if we link to the survey findings, the concern about the US policy under Trump's administration can actually represent that the concern about the decision to stop the USAID from continuing their intervention in Indonesia. Yeah, I think it is a big loss for the US in terms of their kind of soft power in Indonesia, institutional influence in Indonesia. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. I think that's really nicely connected to the survey question about soft power, and directly affected USAID's role and America's perception. Thank you. We have a question more generally about connections between some Southeast Asian countries, including Indonesia, and more Middle Eastern countries, Pakistan, Turkey, around Middle Eastern issues, like helping to open the Strait of Hormuz, a Gaza-centered development plan called the Oasis Plan. Just wondering, maybe first with Melinda, and then maybe if Julie has any thoughts from the political side. You did have in your survey a kind of ranking of preferred alignment or partnerships. I didn't notice if there are any, or how are there Middle Eastern countries or countries outside of the Asia region that were listed. Are there any connections made in the survey between Indonesia and non-Asian countries?
Yeah, Chris, so regarding to the question that you referred to about, I believe it's about the ranking of 11 ASEAN dialogue partners, right? I
Yes.
think if you look at the current ASEAN dialogue partners, there are only 11 countries, and none of them are is Eastern country. So there are New Zealand, Australia, ASEAN dialogue partners. So yeah, we do not have any input regarding on that. But Julia, would you like to maybe comment
Yeah,
regarding
I'll
the?
jump in here. This data is a bit older, but our program specifically does a sort of long, what's the word for it? It's a very long interval between the two surveys that we have so far, and the last one we did was in 2022. So next year we're due to do one. This is a nationwide public opinion, so different from this one, not elite opinion survey, but we asked them on different questions. And what was interesting in 2022 when we did that was countries like Turkey, countries like Saudi Arabia were countries that Indonesians seem to be very interested in. And this Muslim majority identity, I think, is important. What is going on now? I think Indonesia has a hard time domestically sort of. Wage mentioned the Board of Peace, right? Whether or not that was a correct decision for its foreign policy sort of came to light when the 4 peacekeepers were killed in Lebanon. And so I think that conversation nationally hasn't completed yet. And while the Indonesians will be interested in wanting to help develop Gaza, there are also tensions there because of what's going on with Palestine, right? So none of these issues are easy. And truth be told, I'm not a realist, but if you read Mearsheimer, one of the issues is even though Indonesia is the world's largest majority Muslim country, geographically it is very far away from the Middle East. So regardless of the interests of the country and regardless of what the elite want and even what the president wants, while it has joined the Board of Peace, ultimately I think the solutions will come more from the Middle East countries than from Southeast Asian countries, right? So I think the Board of Peace is a good illustration of, you've signed up to this plan. It looked sort of like a good plan. Then the Iran war happened. What do we do now? And the fact that none of the countries have actually walked away and left the board suggests to me that they do want something to come out of this. But I suspect things are just happening so quickly, and they're dealing now with the domestic fallout of what's happening in Iran and the tension over the Strait of Hormuz. So I don't know that there are any coherent, is probably the right word, plans for how to proceed as a member of the Board of Peace, right? Yeah, I'll stop there before I say something I regret.
Oh, thanks. It is a very key illustrative example of the Board of Peace. It's interesting to see what will happen with that. So the next question is, as usual, great surveys lead to forward-thinking questions and asking for divining into the future. So the next question is asking you guys to think about the trend for what is deteriorating perceptions of the U.S. in Southeast Asia. Your chart, Melinda, was really excellent, showing the up and down relationship between how Indonesia perceives China versus the U.S. The audience member is just curious, do you think that these trends are hard to reverse? Is it sort of once you do the damage, does your data show that you can't repair easily and get back in good graces? Or what are you seeing sort of in those kind of trends of who Indonesians prefer?
That's a very difficult question, Chris. But to me, by looking at 8 years of data set that we have, right? It seems that ASEAN overall, the overall perception in ASEAN is whoever in the White House, whoever is the president in the White House, we want him or her to be more engaged with the region, introduce more pragmatic approach to the region that are beneficial. I mentioned to you briefly about, when the Biden administration mentioned roll out the IPEF, right? So the perception towards the US recovered a little bit in Indonesia. That can be a reference point, I think, for the US policymaker on how to engage with ASEAN and how to recover their trust, right, in the region. Yeah, introducing more pragmatic and beneficial programs for the region. I think that's gonna be the quick gain.
That makes sense. Yes, thank you, Melinda. Next question, maybe for Dr. Siwage, if you don't mind, to give your thoughts about Asian centrality. So thinking about certain things that are very relevant that ASEAN's trying to do right now with the current crisis, like shared energy grids, or trying to have sort of a joint approach to managing economic and energy security. Also, the survey mentioned the attempts, somewhat positive, by Indonesia specifically, but ASEAN to work on these conflict issues in Myanmar and Thai-Cambodia border. So the audience member is asking for your thoughts about how Indonesia can preserve and strengthen ASEAN centrality.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think this is a difficult question for, I think, all the policymakers in ASEAN. Yeah, how to strengthen and preserve the ASEAN centrality. Yeah, we have been talking about this for many years, and somehow there's no concrete strategies how to really achieve that. So this is just my opinion. I think Indonesia, as the largest member in ASEAN, should maybe lead by example. If Indonesia can lead by example, that putting ASEAN as a central agency for dealing with either US or China, then we may have the kind of the opportunity to maintain or promote the ASEAN centrality. But yeah, I think big country like Indonesia or other countries, I think in the survey it is mentioned Singapore, Indonesia, right? And then Malaysia. If all the big ASEAN members, they start to put more priority on ASEAN in terms of the institutional foundation for their foreign policy and also for economic or trade negotiation with US and China, then yeah, I think we may be able to see that the progress towards that direction. But again, that is not easy to do. Yeah, I know that different countries in ASEAN also has their own national interests, and somehow their national interests contradict with the ASEAN goals or objective.
Right. Well, if I can ask you a follow-up question on trade, this one between Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN and China specifically. Let me read the question from our co-chair, Ambassador Robert Blake. He notes that China is the largest investor and trading partner for most Southeast Asian countries. But as the US closed its markets for Chinese manufactured exports, like EVs and others, Chinese companies increasingly are looking to export their manufacturing goods to ASEAN, which of course could undercut local manufacturing all across Southeast Asia. Are there any data points that show this kind of concern in the survey?
Yes, thank you. This is a very good point. I think there's no direct question about this Chinese overcapacity, how it affects the ASEAN member states in terms of their economic impact. And also for Indonesian, there's no direct question on that. But I believe that this issue is captured by the respondents' concern when they say that the impact on unemployment and cost of living, right? So why I mentioned about unemployment, because again, the flood of Chinese products in many countries in ASEAN, including Indonesia, has increased the competition within the local economy. So many of the local industries, small, medium enterprises, they are struggling to compete with the Chinese low-cost products. And as a result, many of them they have to close their business. So that's affect the overall employment in Indonesia. So yeah, I think there is no direct question that leads to this point. But maybe Melinda can correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, I think in terms of the economic impact, it can be seen by the indirectly from the public concerns about the jobs and cost of living.
Yeah, to answer to Ambassador Bob Blake question about the perception on China, I think the question on page 52 of the survey is particularly relevant. What could potentially worsen your positive impression of China? I think for this year's survey, most of respondents cited China's interference in my country's domestic affairs, including through social media and influence over the ethnic Chinese citizens of my country. That's the most cited uh, uh, choice. And then the second one is China's strong arm tactic in the South China Sea and the Mekong. And the third one is definitely on the China's use of economic tools and tourism to punish my country's foreign policy choices. So definitely, yes, I think that reason can influence the perception on China in the region.
Great. Thank you both for those answers. Next question is about Russia. And maybe again, back to the dialogue partner data you had, Melinda. If Russia was listed and how it fared in terms of comparing to other potential dialogue partners, given the sort of change in preferences that seems to be happening.
I think the perception towards Russia across survey year is quite dismal, in my opinion. If you just look at the dialogue partners' strategic relevance to ASEAN question on page 40, most of ASEAN respondents rank Russia at the 9th place, just before Canada and New Zealand. So definitely in terms of pragmatic cooperation, strategic cooperation, most of ASEAN countries did not put Russia that high, but you can see some variations definitely exist in some ASEAN countries. Vietnam ranked Russia at the 5th, Indonesia 6th, Thailand 7th. So yeah, I think it's quite useful benchmark to understand the influence of Russia.
Thank you. That is quite interesting to show that there hasn't been a whole lot of change in perceptions of Russia.
Can I add,
Please.
Chris? Yeah, Russia is considered as an important partner now by the current administration. Yeah, in terms of energy, for example, President Prabowo has visited Russia to talk about potential energy cooperation, including nuclear development with Russia. So it is not really captured in the survey, but as I mentioned, that within the elite, there are variation in terms of perception. Maybe some elite thinks that Russia is not important, India is more important, but yeah, I think we can see from what happened. The president has visited Russia several times, meaning that he has a certain kind of a belief that Russia is an important dialogue partner or even the strategic partner for Indonesia.
Thank you very much for that context. It's really important. We do have a follow-up question for Julia. One of the viewers was intrigued by your comment where you said, oh, Southeast Asia and Indonesia really want to do business with the US, but US is making it more and more difficult to do business. The viewer would be happy to hear your thoughts to expand on that or any specific data points that would clarify that. Over
Yeah,
to
I
you,
think
Julie.
I meant it more sort of, and I believe I used the term, "We'd really like to work with you." So it's a complicated relationship, and I think historically in Southeast Asia, views of the US have been mixed from the start, right? We've come through the Cold War, we've come through the Vietnam War, we've come through all these different periods. And Indonesians' perception of the US were very positive when President Obama was in power, partly because of his own family history, and he had a very personal interaction with the country, and Indonesians were very proud that that was the case. So it's a complex, when you say, is there data to support this? If you look at general data on Indonesians' perceptions of the US from actually probably a Pew survey would show it. It goes up and down. So while this particular survey that we're talking about tonight doesn't quite have that question and doesn't quite have that phrasing, I meant it in terms of a sentiment that Southeast Asia as a whole must work with the US and all great powers, that want to do business here. But a lot of the actions coming out of the US at this point of time, globally and regionally, make it difficult for some administrations in Southeast Asia to justify working with the US and to explain to their populations that that is necessary. So, and I speak like this because I'm a qualitative researcher. Wage speaks in a different way because he's an economist. But I think sentiments are important, especially when it comes to foreign policy. And, while this is still an elite survey, I speak also from knowing what my peers. So I'm Singaporean, Melinda and Wage are Indonesians. When I speak to scholars from Indonesia and when I go to Indonesia and speak to people, there's this sense of concern and worry because it is a very important relationship. Nobody can afford not to work with the US. But they're all realizing it's really, really difficult at points of time. And we happen to be in a very difficult juncture at this moment, right? With the war in Iran and, following on from terrorists and all that. So that's what I would say.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a really good point. Be interesting to see next year what the changes show. Hopefully something positive. Well, we've come to the end of the question period. No more questions. So I'd like to invite each of you just to give a couple comments in closing, maybe some couple remaining thoughts or a summary you'd like to have us all take away from the survey and your analysis. And from me, I don't know if it's possible, but often surveys will ask a very general question like, are things going in the right direction or wrong direction, right? So is ASEAN going in the right direction or wrong direction? I don't know if that is any inkling from the data that you can tell us about, but I'll invite each of you to just give a few closing thoughts and then we'll wrap up. So I'll start with Melinda, over to you.
Yeah, Chris, first I would like to just highlight that, sometimes surveys, they are snapshots in time, right? So the perception can be influenced by major events, as our survey consistently suggested, right? If you just look at how we capture the data over years. And then second of all is I just want to echo what Pak Siwage mentioned earlier, whether the performance of the US is this year can be interpreted as Southeast Asia pivot to China. I think there is still a lot of nuances in the survey. I highlighted earlier that the region, they are very good in hedging. They put ASEAN as the most important actor for doing more in terms of international trade and also for taking a role in more in the global stage. And then there is a desire for a multipolar world order where regional respondency, India is becoming more important. Likewise, other middle powers like Japan, South Korea. So I think we still need to look at the result in a more calibrated way.
Thank you very much, Belinda. That's very insightful. Thanks. Over to you, Julia. Your thoughts?
I'll turn to my favorite section of the survey, and if you have it in front of you and you've clicked on the link, it's on page 73, the most preferred country to live or work in. So to your question about is Southeast Asia going in the right direction, I think it is because the respondents actually picked an ASEAN member state as their top choice to live or work in, and I think that shows a confidence in the region, a positive sort of optimistic view that there are opportunities here. There is growth despite all the difficult things happening in the world. It's followed by Japan and then Australia, with the US as a fourth choice, and then an EU member state. So whether or not you believe that things are shifting to Asia, there is a certain optimism, I think, especially amongst some of the younger Southeast Asians. And in this survey, we do survey young and older people. We don't track them by individual responses, partly because of data privacy and all that. But I think if you track it over the years, you see this sort of growing sense that we might be having our moment and we're going to enjoy it.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Great to hear. What was the destination, top destination in ASEAN?
So they were just selecting from a bunch of choices, but it's not a specific country. It just allows you to pick an ASEAN member state or an EU member state. And then later on, there are other questions about where would you like to visit most, where would you like to study, that kind of thing. So it's not a specific country.
Okay,
Julia,
great.
actually, there is a branching out question,
Right.
after
Okay, below,
among
yeah.
those who select ASEAN
right.
country.
Yeah.
I think most of them selected
Right.
Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia. Yeah.
That's the next page. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Singapore,
that's it.
Thailand, and Malaysia. I see. Great.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Very interesting. And over to you, Dr. Siwage, for any closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you. I think this exercise is a long-term kind of it's still a work in progress, right? We don't we cannot interpret all the perception will be translated into policy later on, but we do hope that all this perception information can be used to guide policy. Yeah, of course, it will not be kind of fully translated into policy. But with this kind of discussion, we also expect more feedback as well from the readers or our partners, like USINDO, for example. If you think that there are some question that maybe need to be added, or there are some question that are not quite correct, then yeah, I think that kind of feedback will be useful for us to improve the next iteration of the survey. Yeah, our team is still trying as well to improve in terms of the methodology and the coverage of the respondents to minimize the bias. But again, yeah, as I said, this is a work in progress, yeah, a big project for us. But yeah, I think we really appreciate all the comments that you made. The last point is that about ASEAN, because again, this is the survey is about the state of Southeast Asia, and we want to see whether next year ASEAN can really be in the central, yeah, in the driver's seat, as what all these ASEAN member always kind of mention that they want to see ASEAN to be more proactive and more kind of influential in the decision making or foreign policy. We want to see that really happen in the next few years. But that's the hope. And yeah, I think we still don't know what will be the answer. But thank you again for this opportunity, Chris, and everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siwage and everyone. We will share a link to your full report when we post this video online. So for the audience members, you can either go to the ICS website or you'll see it when we send out the link to the video for this. Great thanks to all of you. Your report is always excellent every year. We're looking forward to it. Can't wait for it to come out. And I'll hand back over to Ambassador Merrill for his closing statement. Oh, I think you're on mute, Ambassador Merrill. If you can unmute. There you go. You're still muted, looks like. Well, Ambassador Merrill, shall I just thank the guests on your behalf and also the audience for attending today? On behalf of Ambassador Merrill, go ahead.
You.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Great.
I want to thank everyone who participated in the program from the ISCS Yusuf Ishak Institute. It's extremely interesting. It's a study I didn't know existed before. I recently found out. I do have maybe a couple technical things that I can communicate separately about some questions. It's very important for us all to see the trends in public opinion and the effect of recent U.S. policies on changes in public opinion. And this will continue to evolve. And we appreciate your excellent study for informing us. We hope to do this again. Thank you.